Qamar Cheema, and viewers, please do subscribe my YouTube channel NHS Media, which is an English channel. And I'm honored and thrilled to have with me Mr. John Blexland. Mr. John is a professor of international security and intelligence studies at the Strategic and Defense Studies in the Australian National Study University. Thank you very much, John, for your time.
Come on, good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me on your program.
Thank you very much, John, for your time. John, the world is talking a lot about what's going on in Indo-Pacific. Recently, there was an article, there was a discussion that there should be an Indo-Pacific Charter. Indo-Pacific Charter should be like the one that was after the World War II. And even there are some serious discussions going on that this charter must be proposed by Japan and England. What do you make of this Indo-Pacific Charter? Do you believe that there is a need of this charter since the rise of China is there?
So I'm open to suggestions and I'm open to the idea, but I'm a little bit skeptical about the ability to pull it off. There's a couple of challenges. One is that it is hard to define what gets included and what gets excluded. From Australia's point of view, the Indo-Pacific includes Australia, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and Asia, Eastern and Southern Asia. But from India's and Pakistan's perspective, the Indo-Pacific looks different. It includes more of East Africa and the Middle East. Of course, if you go to the other side of the Pacific, to Canada or a country like Chile, you don't get that much of a sense of Africa or the far side of western side of the Indian Ocean. So whose view counts? Whose perspective is the one that trumps the ones of others? So I'm a little bit, open-minded about how you define it, but also who to include and who to exclude. Of course, the other side is that the concept of the Indo-Pacific is seen by China as being framed against it. It objects to the idea of the Indo-Pacific. It much prefers Asia-Pacific because the concept of Indo-Pacific, to them, it appears, suggests more about giving India prominence as opposed to the Indian Ocean. And to my mind, I like the concept of the Indo-Pacific because it's actually a bit like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic isn't actually about the North Atlantic. It's about Europe and North America. It's about the land masses on either side of the North Atlantic. And that's, to my mind, one of the reasons why the idea of the Indo-Pacific. It's about the land masses that abut the Indian and Pacific Oceans that make it resonate and make it hang together. So I can understand on one level why China is reluctant, because the Americans have comes to a certain extent out of a lot of political imperatives coming out of Japan to bring India into the equation. The United States has bought in on it to engage more in South Asia, particularly India, but not just India. And so China sees that in adversarial and zero-sum terms as being something hostile. And I don't think it needs to be that way. And this is something that China has some leeway as to how it wants to interpret it. Very interesting to see how ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they came up with this idea of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Rather than adopting it holus bolus, they decided to give it a ASEAN spin to some respects, accommodate China's resistance, and at the same time accommodate US and Japanese enthusiasm for it. But so there's a couple of dimensions there. In addition, you've got the issue of, well, whose worldview is going to be the central dominant one? And this is where I think China has the strongest kind of basis for its unease, because it seems to be mostly about bolstering an American-focused, rules-based international order, which, people say, what are you talking about, John? The rules-based international order, what the hell is that? Well, I like to say it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire we used to read about in medieval times in Europe, which is not holy, not Roman, and not really an empire, and yet it still existed. It was this political body in the middle of Europe that didn't actually include Rome, funnily enough. So the rules-based international order, yes, you can point to lots and lots of exceptions, but the bottom line is that we're all beneficiaries of the international order that kind of sprang from the United Nations related institutions after the Second World War. World Health, World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, the United Nations, the UN General Assembly, the Security Council, the sense of order and the normative effect on international relations of those institutions, which for countries like Australia and Pakistan and others around the world, small to middle powers, are incredibly important, because we're not powerful enough to assert ourselves militarily. We can't demand other countries do what we want. So we appeal to that rules-based international order, and for our own interests to be pursued and accommodated. Now, this is where the position of the United States is a little bit unsettling, because the United States under Trump and then under Biden as well, to a certain extent, has been reluctant to and be enthusiastically supporting some of those institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, regional economic groups like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and so on, that are kind of the fibers, if you like, that connect the international order, the international community, and in effect deliver stability and a degree of order. So how do you define that? Well, it's no easy task, and it's going to be challenging to make it work. I can't hear you, Qamar.
Sorry. So I was just saying that the word agrees with the rules-based international order, and having a new charter, like it will be very difficult maybe for the countries in the region. And it's just like what's going on in South America or in Africa or in other parts of the world. One more thing on this, one more question on this is: do you think that the Americans have been able enough to sensitize the countries in Indo-Pacific about the Chinese threat, or do you think that the countries in the region take it otherwise?
So, very interesting question, because I think what we've seen in the last few months is a retreat from the wolf warrior rhetoric from President Xi and from his diplomats, but the substance has not changed particularly significantly. So the Philippines continues to be harassed inside its own exclusive economic zone, but inside China's so-called 9-dash line. China continues to refuse to acknowledge the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling, about which basically negated the claims of legitimacy for the 9-dash line that China put forward, and reaffirmed the legitimacy of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China has refused to acknowledge that. So what we're seeing is a lot of countries, and particularly after events last year. So last year we saw not only biting sanctions against countries like Australia, after many other countries had been experiencing this. Korea, Japan, Canada, Sweden, Norway, many countries have been at the sharp end, the pointy end of China's sharp power, if you like, the imposition of sanctions, gratuitous and targeted punishing sanctions that were meant to punish. But in Australia's case, they haven't really been all that effective, because Australia's been able to diversify its markets. And, as I say, the global economy is not a command economy. There's supply, demand, there's bear markets, there's bull markets, there's floods, there's droughts, there's famines, there's feasts, there's changes in trends and popular commodities. So no one controls that. No one person or one entity completely controls it. It's very volatile and dynamic. So that works in our favor effectively. And so the order is not so ordered, if I can put it that way. But that's
So
not quite answering your question, though, is it?
yeah. So John, how the countries in the region, in Australia and other, Indonesia, and largely how the countries in the region look at this Chinese spy balloon? This new controversy has come up, and everybody is talking on that, and I'm in Washington, and we're looking that there's a lot of talk in the American media, and so there is a lot of talk on the all global media. So, how the countries in the region see this Chinese spy balloon? Do you think that this is a traditional Chinese way of gathering intelligence, or do you believe that this is something new? You yourself have been teaching intelligence, so
Mm.
you must have looked at more carefully.
Yes, so I have a book coming out in a few weeks' time called Revealing Secrets: An Unofficial History of Australian Signals Intelligence and the Advent of Cyber. And in that book, I talk about the significance of satellites in particular, but balloons is something that we go back, more than 200 years, going back about 230 years actually. So the 1790s, when they were first used in the time of the French Revolution, and then in the Napoleonic Wars. So they've ebbed and flowed in popularity. They're actually quite difficult to control and to utilize effectively. So they were used initially. Napoleon's campaigns used them for a little while, but they're difficult to keep going. The Brits tried using them in the early 19th century. The US and Confederate forces used them in the Civil War in the 1860s, but once again with limited benefit. They were used by the Brits in the late 19th century in African colonial wars. They were used in the First World War to try and spy across the Western Front beyond the trenches to establish where troops were concentrating, where artillery was best to target the enemy. But essentially, since the advent of the aircraft and then of satellites, they've gone out of vogue. They were used a little bit in Iraq and Afghanistan as tethered balloons to provide additional surveillance around forward operating bases, but not so much from a satellite, almost like a satellite. And that's something we've seen a resurgence of recently, particularly in light of the congested space of the low Earth orbit space, where most satellites have been operating, with the advent of anti-satellite missile testing by China and Russia, and the proliferation of space junk. It's a much more dangerous space now in that low Earth orbit space. So the high altitude balloons give you some flexibility, some additional options. You can tether to that balloon the same kind of sensor suite of capabilities that could go on a satellite. But of course, a balloon can hover for longer, and it can, at lower altitude, get a higher degree of fidelity in its photography or in its absorption of radio frequency emanations from the ground. So there's some utility there, and it's clear that it's not just China that's been developing this capability. The United States and others have been exploring its utility. But the scale in recent days and last couple of weeks has generated a whole new sense of unease about what this means, what the potential utility of such balloons might be. Remembering, of course, that in the Second World War, Japan used balloons to send incendiary bombs across to North America, using the trade winds to do that. And so that's really interesting when you think about, well, how could a country in a war seek to utilize such technology? A piece of canvas and helium, and tie on the bottom a bomb or some kind of a device to either interfere, interrupt, destroy capabilities over a target area. And you do that relatively cheaply. Balloons are not expensive. So if you're testing a capability, if you're testing the reaction, it's not inconceivable that, like drones, you can proliferate them by the hundreds at a relatively low cost. You don't have to get a rocket to launch them into space. So people are starting to think about a whole range of additional scenarios that they haven't been thinking about. And our defence system, so in Australia, we have the Joondalup Operational Radar Network. The United States and Canada have the NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defence Command. Europe has its surveillance systems and networks that are about radars, about propagation, that have been tuned to the picking up of missiles and aircraft, not balloons. And balloons have gone largely below the radar scope, if you like, below the detection threshold. And now we're seeing the radar operators retweak their radars to try and look out for these slow-moving metal boxes in the stratosphere, which was not a space where people were looking, monitoring, because it's not the space where you can find MiG aircraft or ballistic missiles operating. You're going to find them in outer space, or in the initial plume from its launch on Earth, and so on. So that stratospheric space is not one that's been focused on, and it's resuming its being a point of interest.
So, John, we have been, obviously there's a lot of literature that is being written, that have been written and is being written on the weaponization of space. So, do you have any evidence that the Russians have sent such kind of technologies over North America before?
So it's I haven't seen anything myself, but there's certainly question marks now about these latest unconfirmed objects, unattended aerial platforms, as they're now calling them, as opposed to UFOs, UAPs rather than UFOs. But unattended aerial platforms, or unidentified aerial platforms, are generating considerable interest. And it will be interesting to see what is confirmed, whether there are indications that this is Russian technology. I suspect it's maybe not, because perhaps I think Russia is experiencing some real challenges at the moment technologically, and its focus is very much more on managing its challenges in trying to look like it might be winning in Ukraine, when it's clear that they've been suffering severe setbacks and casualties. The casualty rates, as you know, Qamar, are turning out to be horrendously high, and you wonder where the pain threshold for Russia actually is. How much more pain can they tolerate for such little gain? And so that will be very interesting to watch. But it's also interesting legally that space, well, I say space, the domain, if you like, of the stratosphere, higher than where aircraft normally fly, not quite in outer space, which is broadly considered not to be territorial space, but it's legally in a twilight zone, and literally and metaphorically a twilight zone, where you don't normally require permission for overflight rights like you do for operating an airliner, say 35,000 feet above another country. You would get permission and you would pay a license for overflight rights or permissions. For something up at 80,000 feet, well, nobody flies that high normally. It's not considered the normal space. So this is interesting new ground, or new space to explore, high ground, if you like, above the Earth.
So, John, we have just heard that the United States and the Philippines have agreed to restart the joint patrols in South China Sea. Do you really believe that there is going to be any kind of misadventure in the region, or any sort of miscalculation? Obviously, there are chances of that. So, obviously, I think the Americans have taken this very offensive, this balloon thing and these unidentified objects.
Yes.
So, looking at these military patrol, or the military, what we call joint patrols in the South China Sea, do you find there is a possibility of any miscalculation? While the Chinese have just said today that there have been American balloons as well on their territory, maybe, yeah.
Yes, I must admit I'm a little bit skeptical about that. That's classic obfuscation and deflection and distraction. It would be perfectly understandable for China to try that approach. But what is interesting is that the wolf warrior diplomacy and their exercise of, their maritime militia, their use of the Coast Guard, their really adversarial approach towards a zero-sum interpretation of their interests versus the interests of other Southeast Asian littoral states has come back to haunt them. Back in 2016-17, when Rodrigo Duterte came to office after the arbitral tribunal ruling in the Philippines' favor, Duterte went to Xi and said, look, let's not worry about the arbitral tribunal ruling. Let's put that to the side. Let's just be friends, in an evident attempt to try and engage China, induce China to invest more heavily in the Philippines and try and cut some slack to the Philippines. And here we are 6 years later, and President Xi just hasn't been able to help himself. He hasn't been able to cut Philippines any kind of slack. He's been relentless in his pursuit of the territorial claims of the 9-dash line, ignoring the UNCLOS and irritating the hell out of the Filipinos to the point where the new president, Bongbong Marcos, basically says enough's enough, bring back the Americans, let's call off all this sweet talk with China about negotiating in the South China Sea. So it's clearly not worked. But having said that, the game's not yet over. This is just another chapter, another iteration, and we could yet see considerable confrontation. The South China Sea is getting crowded, it's getting tense, it's getting potentially fraught with additional danger.
Okay, one last quick question, John, as that is about India. And that question is that with all that competition in the region, what do you see the Indian position? They're trying to balance their relations with the Russia. They're trying to engage, cooperate, and compete with the China. And they're also getting all the incentives from the Western parts, particularly the United States. So, how do you see the role in Indo-Pacific and particularly in these times when they have tried to balance themselves with the West and with the Russians? Yeah.
So India, the way India views the world is very different from the rest of us. It's a Quad member, but it's not as integrated with or compatible with American technologies as Japan and Australia are. It has historically, as you know, Qamar, relied heavily on Soviet and Russian military equipment. It's looking to wean itself off Russian equipment and diversify to get more European and American technology. The P-8, the French submarines and other things are part of that equation, but it is a long way to go, and they are still very, very mindful that they face two nuclear powers. One is Pakistan and one is China, and most recently the most belligerent of those has been China by a country mile. China has been asserting itself in the over the line of actual control in the Himalayas in a way that seems to be it's been very counterproductive in terms of the goodwill that India had been displaying towards China, the willingness to accommodate China. That willingness has largely evaporated. So we're seeing many Chinese technologies banned in India. And we are seeing a surprising level of enthusiasm from India for the Quad, for relations with the United States, with NATO countries, and trying to quarantine the relationship with Russia, because they know that that's really toxic when it comes to the West and Ukraine, but they still need access to Russian technology, at least for the foreseeable future. So they've got to try and protect that relationship to enable the ongoing flow of parts and equipment to sustain, the sunk cost of 3 generations of military technology. So they're in a difficult predicament. China is clearly their gravest concern. There's a considerable unease still, obviously, in the relationship between India and Pakistan, but not nearly as much as was the case at previous junctures, and certainly not as much as with China. Of course, for India, how much Pakistan engages with China is a deeply worrying point of concern, a focus for them. And so there's a question then about how much Pakistan wants to ingratiate itself more with China, how much that's going to actually work to make domestic politics more difficult inside Pakistan itself, and whether or not there's another path for Pakistan to choose, and whether or not India can actually contribute to enabling Pakistan to take a different path as well. These are all very interesting questions. They're very unique to India, and India, of course, is a very big part of the Indo-Pacific equation, a growing part.
Absolutely right. It's a growing power, and it's a very important country when it comes to the reliance of the Americans and the others in the region, particularly in competition with China. Thank you very much, my friend John Blaxland, Professor of International Security at the Australian National University, for speaking with NHS Media. Thank you very much.
Great to be with you, Qamar. Thank you for having me on the program.